Hey everyone, this is the final section of the bonus audio section, and we will be going through just a couple questions that people have already submitted about podcasting. Now, if you do have questions and you happen to be listening to this before April 13th, we will have a live AMA, so I'm happy to answer more questions then, or you can submit questions to me directly on Telegram or ask them in the Telegram group, and others I'm sure would be happy to jump in. Now, these questions, a lot of them are actually quite similar, and we'll be just revisiting some of the concepts that we've gone through in the prior three sections, but I'll read them out and we'll go through them one by one. So the first question is, how do I grow a company podcast without leveraging a big existing audience? Like, think of your classic company that no one really cares about and they decide to start a podcast. How could it not suck? So this is a great question, and I think really plays into some of the things that we've talked about in both section 2 and section 3. So the section 2 being, how do I actually create something that's differentiated and worth listening to? And section 3 being, how do I actually distribute it? It sounds like with this company, they wouldn't have a large existing audience. The first question answering that is really about this idea of, what does your company know that most people don't know? And it can be simple, or as simple as specific data that you have that most people don't know about, some insight that you know of because you've run your company in X industry and most people don't know that, right? Now, one thing to keep in mind is some of those approaches work much better for different mediums. So we've talked about this before, but if you have some really, really unique singular insight about something, that perhaps is better suited for an infographic or a single blog post relative to a long, podcast or several episodes of a podcast. So that's something to keep in mind. And kind of related to your question, it may not be the best approach for a company that doesn't really have something that's really intriguing to a wide audience to create a podcast about. Now, something else to keep in mind is we've talked about the passive audience and how podcasts target that passive listening differently than perhaps other mediums. This is important because a lot of people tend to, when they're listening to podcasts, focus more on a form of entertainment value. The same way is true with video, where they expect a certain level of entertainment value. And even if your company has specific insights that are perhaps interesting, they may not lend as well to a podcast. Now, with that said, that doesn't necessarily mean that a classically, quote unquote, boring company cannot create a podcast, but they need to go through the same steps of asking, what is our differentiator? What do we actually know that most other people don't know? And then even once you've gotten to that point, you still just have a hypothesis. And when you have that hypothesis, I think we land back into some of the things that I talked about in section 3, which is this idea of creating an MVP for your podcast, same way that you would create an MVP for a product or a company. So once you have that idea, go create a pilot. Don't, assign 3 people on your team or go hire 5 people to go create a podcast. Assign someone on your team to allocate 10%, 20% of their bandwidth to actually thinking through a podcast, recording it, a pilot. It may not be perfect, but enough so that you can start getting feedback and that you can refine that original hypothesis based on that feedback. And then you can even, once you've created that singular first episode or few episodes, go distribute it and see how it does. And if it fails, it's just like another failed experiment that I'm sure happens at every company. So that's the way I'd go about it. And there's no way to guarantee that a podcast is going to be successful. But I think if you actually treat it more like a minimum viable product, you're more likely for it to actually be successful. Okay, so I wanted to actually revisit this question as I thought about it overnight and give some more tangible, actionable advice in terms of, if you are a company and you don't think that your company itself is super bold or interesting or viral, for example, what are the different ways that you could actually start a podcast and have it be successful? So I'm directing us back to some of these questions that we talked about before, where you start with your obsessions or the unique things that you or your company know that perhaps other people don't know. So if you are a company, a lot of people think automatically about the specific product or product lines that they have and how they can create a podcast around that. And I would encourage people to think a little broader about just the unique things that they know, and then also about who your audience is and the widened set of things that they might find interesting. So let me give a couple examples and maybe this will make a little more sense. So if I am an insurance company, for example, instead of creating a podcast about types of insurance or the evolution of the insurance industry, which by nature may not actually be very interesting, at least to some people, then instead you can think about who am I actually targeting? Let's say you're in an insurance industry that has a lot of life insurance products. Instead of talking again about the product itself, you think about your target audience, which perhaps in this case are people who tend to be a little older. And so perhaps you can think through, oh, maybe I'm going to create a podcast about interviewing people in their old age and visiting retirement homes and seeing what advice they have after the long lives they've lived. So that's just an example. To give another concrete example, perhaps you are a trucking or a logistics company. Once again, instead of just thinking through how do I create a podcast about trucking and logistics, maybe I think through, okay, my target audience is maybe truckers or maybe people doing X, Y, or Z in that process. And maybe I'm going to create a podcast that talks through really, really crazy trucking stories where you're not, again, talking about your product, but something that you have unique insight into. What happens when someone ends up spending 30 out of 40 days a month, or that doesn't make sense, 20 out of 30 days a month on the road for 18 hours a day. What happens? What are the stories that emerge from that? Another example is, let's say you're a data company, right? So you parse data, maybe you're an analytics company, and you have access likely to certain data that you're not going to share on a user by user basis, but you can actually aggregate that information in unique ways. And if you are a company focused on data, you can either choose to share your own data, or even if you don't have enough data to create a podcast around, perhaps you create a podcast that talks through the interesting things that people search on Google every year, right? Similar to something like a Reply All podcast, or if you've ever heard of the book Everybody Lies. There's a lot of interesting things that you can do that your target audience will find intriguing that don't necessarily have to speak to your product itself. So I'd encourage people to get creative there, and once again, not just focus on your product line. And just a quick set of tips. If you are, and we talked about this in the book itself, if you're interested in getting ideas in terms of people in a particular space and what they find interesting, you can go to this tool, which is called Unvaka, and enter a particular subreddit. So these are already communities of people who are interested in a particular topic. So I've entered digital nomad into here. If I go into here, I can see all of the different related areas that people might be talking about, right? So if I have a company that's targeting digital nomads itself, sure, I could start a podcast about digital nomads, but maybe I actually also start a podcast about solo travel or really interesting maps or people who work online or the types of things that people are working online, like SEO or marketing or social media. So think a little broader than, again, your very small slice of an industry. And then once you've determined a subreddit or community that people already participate in, you can go into subreddit stats and look through. I've entered digital nomad here. Again, you can actually look into, you saw my toucan pop up there, but submissions, the top submissions for that particular subreddit throughout a year, throughout all time, per month, per week, etc. And this gives you an idea of specifically what are these people talking about and what do they find interesting. So if you scan this, you can see there's people who, throughout the pandemic were unable to travel. Maybe there's a podcast around that. There's people who seem to be upset about how digital nomadism is being represented in social media. So maybe there's a podcast about like the dark side of digital nomadism. There's so many ideas that you can find by just looking at what people are already talking about. So I just wanted to share some of those ideas in addition to what we've already covered in terms of thinking through how you can make maybe not so exciting company exciting if you're thinking through a new podcast. The second question is, I'd like to know about the hardware software setup to have a decent quality podcast without investing too much. The barrier to podcasting seems a bit higher than blogging due to the extra hardware equipment costs. This is definitely true. Your ability to create a podcast does have a little more infrastructure required, and that can cost a little more. I am not going to talk about this very much, and there's an excellent video by Justin Jackson, which is linked in these slides, and he talks all about the different microphones and different hardware and software that you may want to use for podcasting, but I will just reiterate what I've said before. At the end of the day, this is very similar to asking what tech stack a product uses or what blogging platform a blog or newsletter uses. At the end of the day, that's not what will make it successful. So I will direct you to this video and leave it there. The third question is, I was thinking of starting one this year, one regarding a podcast. How would you repurpose your content? So I assume this question is asking about if you have existing content, perhaps a newsletter, perhaps a blog, perhaps a YouTube channel, how would you repurpose your content? I would start with your most popular content. And again, anything related to audio and starting a podcast, especially if it's an ongoing podcast, you need to have some sort of hypothesis there. If you're truly just repurposing your content, maybe your hypothesis is just that some people prefer audio. And that's what we did for Trends, for example, is we just have someone read the newsletter content in audio form, and that's enough. However, if you are doing this as more than just a feature, because that's really what that is for Trend subscribers, a feature for existing subscribers, and you're hoping to actually gain traction with your audio, then I would go through the same thing, this idea of a minimum viable podcast. So take your most popular content, test it in a format that you think is most appropriate, and then launch it as a couple episodes, promote those episodes heavily, and distribute it in some of the ways that we've talked about in section 3, and see if it works, right? See if there is traction there. And if there isn't, then I would say maybe audio is not the best platform for you in repurposing your content. Because remember, content can be repurposed not just with audio, but with video, with many of the different types of content that we talked about at the very, very beginning of this section. And then finally, someone is asking, how would you start one from scratch? I'm thinking about an interview style podcast. So this is a very similar question to some of the others, so I won't go into or really emphasize this idea of an MVP anymore. But what I will say is direct you back to section 2, where we talked about different types of podcasts and the formats that exist. And I would just emphasize to you that perhaps you're thinking of an interview style podcast because it truly is the best format for your content and your audience. But just to go through the set of steps that we talked about to think through whether it truly is, because just because it's the most popular style of podcast today does not necessarily mean it's the best. There's nothing wrong with it, but just go through and think through, what value am I trying to provide, and what mechanism or what format allows me to do that with my audience most effectively. If you are thinking of starting an interview style podcast, I would go through some of the same steps that we've talked about of testing a couple people, in this case, testing a couple episodes, a couple interviews, and see if there is traction, because there is a lot of interview style podcasts that already exist out there today. And as you're going through that process, you always want to go back to that same question of, what is my differentiator? With interview style podcasts, you're really betting on the fact that you either can be a better interviewer, so ask better questions, or that your guests can be significantly better than other guests. And so if you don't actually feel like you can accomplish either of those things, it's going to be really hard to grow an interview style podcast. So I would keep those things in mind, and then, revisit that segment of section 2 where we talk through different formats. So I hope this was helpful. As I mentioned, this is a pretty short section, but it really directs us back to a lot of the content in from sections 1 to 3. So I would encourage you to go revisit those ideas. And if you have any questions, feel free to send them in the DCR community.